Hey guys, tonight we begin with something truly, gloriously exhausting. The daily ordeal of getting dressed as a Victorian woman. Forget the gauzy period dramas where a lady glides downstairs in silk looking effortlessly serene. The truth is that simply putting on clothes in the 1800s was a full contact sport, one involving whalebone, several miles of lace, roughly 15 pounds of fabric, and the genuine risk of passing out somewhere between the corset and the coffee. So before we lace ourselves in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy what I do here, and a sincere thank you to the kind viewer who suggested tonight's topic. Your ideas really do shape everything that happens here, and this channel simply would not be the same without you. Leave a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is, because somehow it is always 2 in the morning somewhere. The channel is also now live on Spotify, so if you would rather drift off with just your ears, the link is waiting for you in the description. And if you ever find yourself wanting even more, members get access to a separate standalone 8-hour ad-free video to sink into on the longest nights. Now dim the lights, switch on a fan for that soft background hum, and get comfortable. Let us pause for a moment. Have you ever wondered how long it takes to get dressed when your outfit has more moving parts than a pocket watch? Could you survive a corset laced by a maid who was mildly annoyed with you that morning? Ever tried to sit down in a steel cage roughly the size of a garden shed, or bend over to retrieve a dropped hairpin while wearing 30 pounds of skirt? What exactly happens if you need the privy and you are, conservatively, 11 garments deep? And how precisely does one fasten 40 tiny boot buttons with fingers that have already gone numb? Well, you are about to find out. Congratulations. You've just woken up in 1875 in a freezing bedroom somewhere in respectable England, and you have roughly 2 hours of hard labour ahead of you before you're even allowed to be seen at breakfast. Good luck. Let us begin where every Victorian day begins, flat on your back in a freezing bedroom, staring at the ceiling and dreading the sheer amount of work between you and breakfast. There is no central heating, so the air in the room is roughly the temperature of a disappointed glare. Somewhere across the room sits the reason you cannot simply roll out of bed and start your day. A towering, folded, layered heap of clothing that would make a modern person weep. Getting dressed today will take longer than most people now spend commuting, and you have not even sat up yet. The window, if you are wealthy enough to have a large one, is doing you no favours. Glass in the 1800s is thin, draughty, and about as insulating as a polite suggestion. A thin skin of frost may well have formed on the inside of the pane overnight, which tells you everything you need to know about the journey your bare feet are about to take across the floorboards. If you're lucky, a housemaid has already crept in before dawn to coax a small fire into the grate, meaning she's been awake and labouring for an hour so that your room might reach the ambitious temperature of merely chilly. If you're not lucky, that grate is cold and dark, and so are you. Your bed itself is a fortress of layered defence against the night. Sheets, blankets, a heavy counterpane, and possibly a nightcap pulled down over your ears, because heat escapes from the head and nobody wants to lose theirs before morning. Leaving that warm nest is the single hardest decision you will make before noon. It is a bit like standing at the edge of a cold swimming pool, except the pool is your entire life, and there is no lifeguard, only a maid with an armful of whalebone, and so you lie there, performing that universal human ritual of bargaining with the ceiling. 5 more minutes, just 5. But the Victorian morning does not negotiate. There is a strict order to the day, a rigid choreography of who wakes whom and when, and your window for lounging is vanishingly small. The house is already stirring below you. Servants are hauling coal and water up staircases that were designed, apparently, by someone who hated legs. Think of it this way. A modern person wakes up, throws on whatever is draped over the nearest chair, and is caffeinated and out the door in under 20 minutes, if truly motivated. You do not have that option. Your outfit has a construction schedule. It has phases. It arguably requires a foreman. What lies ahead of you is less like getting dressed and more like being assembled, and the process is going to eat a genuinely alarming chunk of your morning before you're considered fit to be seen by another human being. So take one last look at that ceiling. Savor this final moment of being unencumbered, unlaced, and unbuttoned, because it is the lightest you will feel all day. In a few minutes you'll be gripping a bedpost while someone braces a knee against your spine, and the memory of this cozy, unstructured warmth will feel like a distant and impossible dream. The fire crackles, the frost glitters. Somewhere down the hall a floorboard creaks under the weight of your approaching maid. There's no more putting it off. It is time to get up, and it is time to get dressed. Heaven help you. Here is the first great indignity of Victorian dressing. You physically cannot do most of it by yourself. The buttons are on the back. The laces are on the back. Half the hooks are in places your arms were simply never designed to reach. So if you are a woman of means, you have a lady's maid, a patient soul whose entire morning is devoted to assembling you like a very complicated piece of flat-pack furniture. And if you cannot afford a maid, you rope in a sister, a mother, a neighbour, or anyone with 2 working hands and a tolerance for your morning mood. The lady's maid was, in the great pecking order of household servants, something close to royalty among the staff. She ranked well above the housemaid scrubbing grates, and her job was intensely personal. She dressed you, undressed you, arranged your hair, cared for your clothing, kept your jewellery in order, and knew more about the true state of your body and your temper than almost anyone else alive. She saw you unlaced. She saw you cross. She saw you first thing in the morning, which is a level of intimacy most people reserve for very few. Think of her, if it helps, as a personal stylist, valet, hairdresser, and seamstress rolled into one, except she also lived in your house, worked staggeringly long hours and earned a wage that would not impress a modern teenager. Her day started before yours and ended after yours, because someone had to be there to unpin you at midnight when you finally staggered home from a dinner party barely able to breathe. Now, this arrangement created a curious dependency. A wealthy Victorian woman, for all her status and silk, was in a very literal sense unable to clothe herself. She could not lace her own corset to the proper tension. She could not fasten the endless spine of buttons marching up her back. She could not reach the hooks at her waist. Her independence, so prized in every drawing-room conversation, quietly evaporated the moment she stood in her chemise and needed a second pair of hands. It is a strange kind of luxury, being so grandly dressed that you're helpless without staff, and the relationship went both ways. A good lady's maid was worth her weight in gold and was often kept for decades, becoming a fixture, a confidant, an institution. A bad one, or an overworked one, or one who was quietly seething about something you said last Tuesday, held a surprising amount of power over your comfort. That corset can be laced snugly and kindly, or it can be laced by someone who is very much not in the mood. You want this woman on your side. You want to be, at minimum, polite to the person who controls your ribcage. For everyone below the maid-keeping classes, the reality was homelier but no less collaborative. Sisters laced sisters, mothers buttoned daughters, neighbours popped in to do each other up before church. Getting dressed was frequently a shared social act, a small, daily conspiracy of hands and hooks, because the clothing simply demanded it. There was no dressing yourself in dignified solitude. There was only the group project. So as you stand there shivering, waiting for those helping hands to arrive, remember this: you're about to be built, and the person doing the building holds your morning, your comfort, and quite possibly your dignity in their fingertips. Be nice to them. You're going to need them roughly 11 more times before bed. It is time to actually put something on, and we start at the bottom of the pile with the chemise. Picture a plain, loose, knee-length shirt made of linen or cotton, roughly as glamorous as a pillowcase with armholes. Its job is simple but heroic. It sits directly against your skin and absorbs all the sweat so that the fabulously expensive layers on top of it never have to touch your body. Because those layers, as we will soon discover, almost never get washed. The humble chemise is the unsung sponge holding this entire operation together. Understand the problem it was solving. The dresses of this era were elaborate, delicate, and made of fabrics that reacted to water and washing about as well as a cat does to a bath. Silk stained, wool shrank, dyes ran, trimmings wilted, and the sheer construction of a gown made throwing it in a tub an act of near vandalism. So the outer layers were spot cleaned, aired, brushed, and otherwise coddled, but rarely fully laundered. Something had to stand between all that precious cloth and the ordinary human business of sweating, and that something was the chemise. It was in effect a barrier garment, cheap to make, easy to wash, endlessly replaceable. You could boil it, scrub it, wring it, and hang it to dry without weeping over ruined finery. So while the dress on top might go weeks or even months between proper washes, the chemise underneath was swapped out and laundered far more often. It quietly took the hit so the good stuff did not have to. Think of it as the undershirt principle taken to its logical, sweat-absorbing extreme. The comparison practically writes itself. Today you might wear a plain cotton tee under a dry clean-only blazer. Precisely so the blazer stays fresh while the shirt does the dirty work. The Victorians simply built an entire wardrobe philosophy on that idea, and then buried it under 10 more layers. The chemise was your body's ambassador to the rest of the outfit, and it worked hard for very little recognition. It was also, mercifully, comfortable, which is a word you will not hear much for the rest of this list. Soft, loose, unstructured, it was the one thing you put on that did not pinch, cage, or compress you. In fact, the chemise was often the same sort of garment a woman might sleep in, which means your first act of dressing was really just trading one soft shapeless shirt for another slightly cleaner soft shapeless shirt. Enjoy it. This is the last time all day your torso will be free. There was no glamour here, and that was rather the point. The chemise was never meant to be seen. It hid beneath everything, its plain hem tucked away, its simple fabric doing its unremarkable duty in total obscurity. A woman might own several in varying states of wear, cycling through them as they were washed and dried. They were the workhorses of the wardrobe, the reliable foundation nobody admired and everybody needed. So as it slips over your head and settles against your skin, give the chemise its due. It is plain, it is humble, and it is about to spend the entire day being sat on, sweated into and utterly ignored, while the corset and the silk take all the credit. But without it, those grand outer layers would be a stained and reeking disaster within a week. It is the quiet hero of the whole affair, and it is, tragically, the most comfortable thing you will wear until you take it all off again tonight. Next come the drawers, the Victorian ancestor of underwear, and here is where things get delightfully practical. For much of the era, drawers were open at the seam. That is to say, they were split right down the middle and left conveniently unstitched. This was not some daring fashion statement. It was pure engineering. Once you are buried under a corset, a cage, and several petticoats, actually removing your underwear becomes a physical impossibility. So the seams simply stayed open, allowing a lady to answer nature's call without disassembling half her outfit. Genius, if you do not think about it too hard. Let us sit with the logistics for a moment. because they are genuinely staggering. By the time you're fully dressed, you will be wearing a corset lace tight up your back, a steel cage strapped to your waist, and a small avalanche of petticoats layered on top. Now imagine needing the privy. Under a modern arrangement, you would simply remove your underwear. Under the Victorian arrangement, removing your underwear would require unlacing, unstrapping, and unlayering a construction project. It is simply not happening. So the drawers were designed to work around the problem entirely by not fully closing in the first place. Drawers themselves were two legs joined at a waistband, and for much of the century those legs were essentially separate, meeting at the waist but left open through the middle. To modern ears this sounds scandalous, even absurd, but to the Victorians it was the most sensible solution imaginable. Modesty was preserved by the mountain of skirts on top. Nobody was seeing anything. And practicality was preserved by the open seam, which meant a woman could relieve herself while remaining fully assembled from the waist down. It was quiet, clever problem-solving disguised as underwear. There is a lovely irony here that is worth savouring. We tend to imagine the Victorians as impossibly buttoned up, prudish to the point of covering piano legs, and yet their most intimate garment was functionally split wide open for the entire day. The prudishness and the practicality lived side by side without the slightest sense of contradiction. The layers above did the work of decency, so the layer beneath was free to be brutally functional. It is a reminder that this era was frequently far more pragmatic than its stiff reputation suggests. Now, fashions did shift over the decades, as they always do. Closed drawers, stitched fully together, grew more common toward the later years of the century, particularly as bicycling and other newly active pursuits made an open seam feel rather less advisable. But for a great stretch of the Victorian age, the open design reigned, precisely because it solved a problem that the rest of the wardrobe created and refused to acknowledge. Consider the alternative and the whole thing snaps into focus. Picture being laced, caged, and petticoated within an inch of your life, then realizing you need the facilities and would have to summon your maid, unpick the entire lower half of your outfit, and then have it all reassembled afterward several times a day. It would be a full-time occupation. The open seam turned an ordeal into a manageable inconvenience, and for that generations of women were quietly, deeply grateful. So on go the drawers, split seam and all, another layer settling into place over the chemise. They are plain, they are practical, and they carry a small secret of pragmatism that would horrify anyone who imagines the era as nothing but repression and rules. The Victorians could be rigid about a great many things, but when it came to the simple, unavoidable business of being a human body inside 20 pounds of clothing, they were surprisingly willing to cut a corner where it counted, or, more accurately, to leave one open. Now quick, put your stockings on and do it now while you still can. This is the golden window, the last moment your torso will bend for the foreseeable future. Once the corset arrives, reaching your own feet becomes a distant memory, so the knitted wool or silk stockings go on first, rolled up over the knee and held in place by garters. If you forget this step and try to add stockings after lacing up, you will find yourself either summoning the maid back or performing a slow, red-faced negotiation with the floor. Bend now. You have been warned. This is one of those small, invisible pieces of daily wisdom that the era demanded you simply know. There is a correct order to dressing, and it is not arbitrary. It is dictated entirely by which parts of your body will still function once the scaffolding goes up. Your feet are the furthest thing from your hands, and the corset is about to lock your waist into rigid immobility, so anything involving your feet has to happen at the very beginning, before you're sealed in. Get it wrong, and the whole choreography falls apart. The stockings themselves came in wool for warmth or silk and fine cotton for those who could afford a little luxury against the skin. They reached up over the knee, well past where any skirt would ever reveal them, and they were held up by garters, which were simply bands tied or buckled around the leg to stop the whole thing from slowly, humiliatingly sliding down around your ankle over the course of the day. There was no elastic waistband technology to rely on. There was just a band of fabric or ribbon, and a hope that you had tied it snugly enough. A garter that was too loose meant a stocking creeping steadily downward all morning. A low-grade nuisance you could do absolutely nothing about once dressed. A garter tied too tight meant cutting off circulation to your lower leg, which was its own special misery. So there was a knack to it. A Goldilocks tension you learned through trial and error, snug enough to hold but loose enough to leave your foot attached to a functioning blood supply. The real lesson of this segment, though, is about bending, because bending was a luxury you were about to lose entirely. Think about how casually you bend over in a modern day. You drop a pen, you scoop it up, you tie your shoe without a second thought. You reach down to scratch your ankle. The corset takes all of that away. Once you're laced, folding forward at the waist ranges from difficult to genuinely impossible, and reaching your own feet becomes a task requiring either a helper, a long-handled tool, or a truly undignified sequence of manoeuvres. So this brief moment, stockings in hand, torso still free, is precious. It is the last time all day you can simply fold in half and touch your toes like a normal creature. Savour the flexibility. Roll those stockings up carefully, secure those garters at just the right tension, and take a mental note of how good it feels to bend, because you are about to file that sensation away until bedtime. It sounds like a trivial detail, and yet it perfectly captures the entire logic of Victorian dressing. Everything is sequenced. Everything is planned around limitation. You do the feet first because soon you will not have feet, in any practical sense. You're essentially preloading all your bending into the opening minutes of the day, front-loading your flexibility before it gets confiscated. Stockings up, garters set, feet handled. Now stand up straight, because that is going to be your default posture for the next 16 hours, whether you like it or not. The bendable portion of your day is officially over. What comes next does not bend. What comes next is the corset. And here it is, the main event, the garment that defines the entire era, the corset. It arrives like a summons, made of sturdy cotton or coutil and stiffened with strips of whalebone or steel. It wraps around your middle and is laced tight up the back by someone standing behind you with their knee braced and their patience thinning. You grip the bedpost. You breathe out. They pull. The point is to smooth and support your shape into the fashionable silhouette of the moment, and the price of that shape is that you will now be aware of your own ribs for the rest of the day. Let us clear up what a corset actually was, because centuries of exaggeration have turned it into a cartoon villain. At its heart, it was a fitted, structured garment designed to support the torso and shape the waistline. It was stiffened with lengths of baleen, the flexible material taken from whales and known then as whalebone, or later with thin strips of steel, all sewn into channels running vertically through the fabric. These bones gave the garment its structure, letting it hold a firm shape rather than simply crumpling like an ordinary shirt. The lacing ran up the back, which is precisely why you needed those helping hands from a few segments ago. The person behind you drew the laces snug, working the tension up and down until the corset closed around your middle and settled into place. How tight was tight? For most women, most days, the answer was firm but wearable, snug support rather than agonizing compression. The corset was closer to a very structured, very committed foundation garment than to the medieval torture device of popular imagination. That said, the sensation was unmistakable. Once laced, You sat up straighter because the garment gave you no other choice. Slouching was not an option. The bones simply would not allow it. Your posture became upright and formal by force, which is part of why Victorian women in photographs look so composed and rigid. They were not necessarily models of self-discipline. They were wearing a garment that made bad posture physically impossible. There is a reason the corset defined the era so completely. Beneath every fashionable silhouette, under every gown you've ever seen in a museum or a painting, there was a corset doing the structural work. It was the foundation the entire outfit was built upon, the layer that created the shape everything else was draped over. Remove it, and the fashionable figure of the age simply collapses. The corset was not one accessory among many. It was the architecture of the whole enterprise. Now, the modern comparison. Think of the most aggressively supportive shapewear you can imagine, then add a rigid internal frame, then make it lace up the back so you cannot possibly put it on alone, then commit to wearing it every single waking hour of every single day from girlhood onward. That gives you a rough sense of the corset's role. It was normal. It was expected. A respectable woman wore one as unthinkingly as a modern person puts on shoes. Children grew up in lightly boned versions. Working women wore sturdier, more practical ones that let them labour. Fashionable ladies wore finer ones tuned to the shape of the season. The corset spanned every class. It was nearly universal, differing mainly in quality, decoration, and just how much shaping the wearer was after. So grip that bedpost, breathe out, and let them pull. The corset is closing around you, and with it comes the defining physical experience of Victorian womanhood. You will stand taller, you will breathe more shallowly, and you will not forget for one waking moment that you are wearing it. Let us talk about the wasp waist, that impossibly narrow silhouette every fashion plate insisted was the height of elegance. Some women practiced what was called tight lacing, gradually cinching the corset smaller and smaller in pursuit of a waist you could supposedly circle with two hands. Now, historians love to argue about how extreme this really got, and the truth is that most everyday women laced for comfort and support rather than to crush themselves in half. But the fashionable ideal was real. The social pressure was real, and somewhere out there a young woman was absolutely being told to hold her breath and think of the silhouette. The wasp waist took its name from exactly what it sounds like, the dramatic pinch of an insect's middle, and it was the shape fashion drawings adored. Illustrations of the period show women with waists so tiny and torsos so smoothly flared above and below that they look barely capable of containing a full set of internal organs. These images were aspirational, idealized, and frequently exaggerated by the artists themselves, but they set the standard that real women were then measured against. Tight lacing was the practice of chasing that ideal. The idea was to lace the corset a little more snugly over time, day by day, gradually training the body toward a smaller waist measurement. The most dedicated practitioners spoke of it almost like an athletic pursuit, a slow reshaping achieved through persistence. And it existed genuinely. There were women who tight-laced, who took real pride in a tiny waist, and who pushed the practice toward its uncomfortable extremes. But here is where we must be honest and pump the brakes on the horror stories, because this is exactly the kind of history that gets wildly overstated. The lurid tales of women routinely removing ribs, of organs crushed to pulp, of waists cinched to a literal handspan, are mostly just that, tales. They circulated as gossip and scandal even at the time, and they have been enthusiastically repeated ever since because they make for a gripping story. The everyday reality for the vast majority of women was far more moderate. Most women laced their corsets for support and shape, snugly but sensibly, in a way that let them go about the genuinely demanding physical work of running a household or labouring for a living. A washerwoman scrubbing linens all day was not tight-lacing to a wasp waist. She was wearing a sturdy, supportive corset that helped her heave and haul without wrecking her back. Comfort and function ruled the ordinary wardrobe far more than the fashion plates would have you believe. The social pressure, though, was very real, and this is where it stings. Young women were absolutely raised to see a small waist as beautiful, desirable, and proper. There were mothers who laced their daughters more tightly than the girls would have chosen. There was vanity, comparison, and the quiet cruelty of an ideal that no ordinary body could naturally meet. The wasp waist may have been exaggerated in the drawings, but the message behind it landed on real people with real force. The modern parallel is almost too easy to draw. Every era invents an impossible body, and then sells it back to people as something they ought to achieve through effort and discipline, and just a little more suffering. The waist trainers and extreme diets and airbrushed images of today are cut from precisely the same cloth as the wasp waist and the tight-laced corset. The technology changes, the pressure is depressingly consistent. So the wasp waist was part myth and part reality, an idealized shape that a few pursued to painful extremes that most simply approximated and that all women lived in the shadow of. Somewhere tonight in 1875, a girl is being told to breathe in and stand still. The corset is real, the pressure is real, and the perfect silhouette, as always, is just out of reach. Just when you think a layer might finally be visible to another living human, along comes the corset cover, also charmingly known as a camisole. This is a light, often lace-trimmed little garment that goes on over the corset, purely to hide the ridges of the boning and lacing from showing through your dress. Nobody will ever see it. Its entire career is spent smoothing over the evidence of the corset underneath. It is, in essence, a cover-up for your cover-up, and by now you're wearing 4 things and have not yet put on anything anyone would recognize as clothing. The problem it solved was a genuinely practical one. A laced corset has texture. The vertical bones create faint ridges, the seams create lines, and the whole structure sits firmly enough that under a fine or fitted bodice, its outline could subtly print through the fabric. To a Victorian eye trained to notice such things, that was unacceptable. The corset was a foundational garment whose workings were meant to stay entirely hidden, and any hint of its structure showing through the dress was a small failure of presentation. So the corset cover was slipped on over the top, a soft layer of light cotton or fine linen, frequently trimmed with lace or delicate detailing along the neckline, even though almost none of that prettiness would ever be seen. Its job was to blur the edges, to create a smooth transition between the rigid corset below and the dress above, so that when you were fully assembled, the surface read as clean and even rather than ridged and boned. There is something almost poetic about a garment this thoroughly hidden being given decorative touches anyway. The lace trim served no public purpose. No visitor, no fellow guest, no passer-by would ever glimpse it. And yet it was there, a small private flourish, a bit of beauty tucked away where only the wearer and her maid would know. It speaks to a certain quiet pride in the unseen layers, an attention to detail that went all the way down through the wardrobe, even where no eye would ever reach. By this point in the dressing process, the sheer accumulation is becoming comic. Let us count. You have your chemise against the skin. You have your drawers. You have your stockings and garters. You have your corset. And now, over the corset, you have the corset cover. That is 5 distinct garments, and we have not yet reached a single item that a modern person would look at and call an actual outfit. You're still, functionally, in your underwear. Elaborate, layered, painstakingly assembled underwear, but underwear all the same. The camisole, as it was also known, was comfortable at least, a soft counterpoint to the structured corset beneath it. It added a whisper of extra warmth and a barrier between the corset and the dress, which helped protect both. But its defining quality was its invisibility, its sheer devotion to being unnoticed. It existed entirely in service of the appearance of other things. The modern comparison lands neatly. Think of the small hidden fixes we still use to make an outfit sit right. The seamless underlayer worn so nothing shows through, the lining that smooths a silhouette, the discreet layer whose only purpose is to make the visible clothing look better. The corset cover is the ancestor of every garment ever worn solely so that another garment could look its best. It is the ultimate supporting player, content to spend its life off stage. So, on it goes. Layer number 5, another soft addition that no one will ever admire. The corset is now hidden, its ridges smoothed away, its evidence concealed beneath a modest little cover trimmed with lace that only you will ever see. You are beautifully, thoroughly, absurdly prepared, and you are still not dressed. If you are dressing in the middle decades of the era, congratulations, it is time to climb into the cage. The crinoline is a vast dome-shaped framework of flexible steel hoops, suspended from your waist and designed to hold your skirts out in an enormous bell shape, without you having to wear a dozen heavy petticoats to do it. In theory, it was a labour-saving miracle. In practice, you now occupy roughly the same footprint as a small dining table. Doorways become puzzles, chairs become enemies, and a strong gust of wind becomes genuine public relations risk. Here is the genuinely surprising part. The crinoline was invented as a mercy. Before it came along, achieving that fashionably wide bell-shaped skirt meant piling on layer after layer of heavy petticoats, sometimes stiffened with horsehair, until a woman was hauling an exhausting mass of fabric around her legs all day. The cage crinoline replaced all of that with a lightweight frame of thin steel hoops held together by fabric tapes, creating the same grand shape with a fraction of the weight. When it first appeared, women reportedly rejoiced at how much lighter and cooler it was. For once, fashion had actually made life easier. The trade-off, of course, was size. The fashionable silhouette ballooned outward year after year until skirts reached genuinely enormous circumferences, and the woman inside found herself at the centre of a fabric structure several feet across in every direction. You did not simply walk into a room. You arrived, sweeping in like a stately galleon under full sail, and everything designed for normal human dimensions suddenly became a problem to be solved. Doorways demanded strategy. You learned to angle yourself, to compress the hoops slightly with a practiced hand, to judge whether a given gap was passable at all. Furniture became a minefield. Sitting down was an art form, requiring you to control the cage so it did not flip up in front of you like a startled umbrella. And narrow spaces, crowded rooms, and other people's furniture were constant hazards, because you took up so much more room than your actual body did. The wind was its own special enemy. A large hooped skirt caught the breeze like a sail, and there were real accounts of women being knocked off balance, blown about, or worse, in strong gusts. The cage that held your skirt out so elegantly on a calm day became an unpredictable liability the moment the weather turned. Add in open fireplaces, another genuine danger, and the crinoline earned a reputation for being not just cumbersome but occasionally hazardous. It is worth pausing on the sheer social logistics of everyone wearing these at once. Picture a crowded party where every woman occupies the space of a small tent. Picture navigating a staircase, a carriage, a shop, a church pew. The whole physical choreography of moving through the world had to adjust to accommodate these vast swaying domes of steel and fabric, and adjust it did, because fashion demanded the shape and society obliged. The modern mind reaches for comparisons and comes up a little short, because we simply do not wear anything this architecturally ambitious anymore. The closest we get is the enormous formal ball gown or the wedding dress with its dramatic sweep. Garments so large they require help to move in and careful planning to sit down in. The crinoline was that experience, but as everyday wear, worn to walk down an ordinary street on an ordinary afternoon. So you step into the cage, pull it up, and secure it at your waist, and suddenly your relationship with physical space is transformed. You're wider now, grander, and considerably more of a navigational challenge. The frame sways gently as you move, a constant reminder of the sheer volume you now command. It was a labour-saving miracle, truly. It just happened to turn you into furniture. Fashion, being fashion, eventually got bored of the giant bell and moved all the drama to the back. Enter the bustle, a structure of pads, wire, or steel half hoops, strapped to your lower back to project your skirts dramatically outward behind you. Suddenly, the fashionable shape is flat in front and shelved in the rear, a silhouette so pronounced you could reportedly balance a tea tray on it, though please do not. Sitting down now becomes a delicate manoeuvre of perching on the very front edge of a chair, while an entire architectural feature hovers behind you like a deeply committed shadow. The bustle rose to prominence as the great dome crinoline finally fell out of favour. Tastes shifted, as they always do, and the vast circular skirt gave way to a silhouette that pulled all its fabric and structure toward the back. The front of the skirt flattened and fell straight, while behind you erupted a dramatic projection of gathered fabric, swags, drapes, and trailing material, all held up and out by the structure strapped to your lower spine. That structure took various forms over the years. Sometimes it was a stuffed pad tied around the waist. Sometimes it was a cage of wire or a set of steel half-hoops that collapsed and sprang back as needed. Some clever designs even folded up when you sat, so that the whole apparatus could compress and then rebound when you stood again, a small feat of engineering devoted entirely to the shape of your backside. Whatever the mechanism, the goal was the same, a bold, shelf-like projection behind you. And that shelf genuinely was pronounced enough to inspire the old joke that you could rest a tea tray on it, a line people at the time enjoyed as much as we do now. The silhouette it created was striking, a smooth flat front sweeping back to a dramatic cascade of fabric, elegant in a fashion drawing and slightly bewildering in the flesh. It was a shape chosen purely for style, and style, as ever, cared nothing for the practical experience of the woman inside it. Sitting down was the great daily challenge of the bustle years. With an entire structure occupying the space directly behind you, where a chair back would normally welcome you, you could not simply settle into a seat. You perched. You lowered yourself onto the front edge of the chair, kept your spine upright, and let the bustle project out behind you into empty air. Lounging was out of the question. Reclining was a fantasy. You sat like a woman poised to leap up at any moment, because the architecture strapped to your back gave you no other choice. Everyday movement adapted accordingly. Backing up to a chair required judgment. Carriages, benches, and pews all had to be negotiated with the projection in mind. And the fashionable woman learned a whole new vocabulary of graceful movement, designed to accommodate the shape she was wearing, a poised, forward-perched elegance that photographed so beautifully, precisely because it was so carefully managed. The comparison to furniture is not entirely a joke. In a very real sense, you were wearing a small piece of structural architecture, a built form projecting from your body into the surrounding space. Modern fashion occasionally flirts with dramatic, exaggerated shapes on a runway, but rarely does it ask people to actually live in them, to sit and walk and pour tea and pass an entire ordinary day inside a wearable structure. The bustle asked exactly that. So the giant bell of the crinoline deflates, and the drama migrates to the rear, and you strap on your bustle, feel it settle against your lower back, and adjust to yet another entirely new way of occupying the world. Flat in front, grand behind, perched forever on the edge of your seat. Fashion has redecorated the shape of womanhood once again, and once again you simply wear whatever the drawing rooms have decided. Tea tray optional. Cage or bustle, you're still not done building the foundation, because now come the petticoats. These are the underskirts, and you do not wear one, you wear several, layered one over another, to soften the shape of the frame beneath, and to add that satisfying rustle as you move. Some are plain, some are flounced, some are starched to within an inch of their lives. Together they add warmth, volume, and a considerable amount of weight. By this point your legs are wrapped in more fabric than a modern person owns in total, and the actual dress has not even arrived. The purpose of all these underskirts was subtler than simply adding bulk. A crinoline cage or a bustle frame left uncovered was all hard edges and visible structure, the hoops or wires printing their outline against any skirt draped directly over them. The petticoats solved this. Layered over the frame, they smoothed the transition, blurring the mechanical lines of the structure beneath into a soft, even shape that the dress could then sit upon gracefully. Without them, your fashionable silhouette would have looked like a lampshade with the frame showing. They also gave the skirt its movement and its sound. That famous rustle of Victorian dress, the soft swish that announced a woman's approach down a hallway, came largely from petticoats brushing against one another as she walked. Some were starched stiff to hold their shape and add crispness. Others were left soft for comfort and warmth. A lady might layer a plain one closest to the frame, and a finer, flounced one nearer the dress, building up the effect you wanted through careful combination. And then there was the matter of weight, which by now is becoming the recurring theme of your entire mourning. Each petticoat was another garment, another expanse of fabric wrapped around your lower half, and several of them together added up to a genuine burden. In winter this was almost welcome, a bit of insulation against the perpetual cold of an unheated house. In summer it was simply more to carry, more to sweat through, more to haul up and down the stairs. Consider the sheer arithmetic of what your legs are now managing. Beneath the petticoat sits the cage or the bustle. Beneath that the drawers and the stockings, and above the petticoats will soon come the skirt of the dress itself, which is no lightweight either. Layer upon layer upon layer, all gathered at the waist that your corset has already cinched, so that the entire weight of this lower assembly hangs from a middle that has been laced firm. It is a marvel your posture survives the day at all. The comparison to modern dressing borders on absurd, because we simply do not do this. A person today might own a single slip, worn occasionally under a particular dress, and think even that a fuss. The Victorian woman wore a stack of them every single day as an unremarkable matter of course. The foundation nobody saw and everybody assumed. It was as automatic as putting on socks, just multiplied and layered and considerably heavier. There was skill in it too, in knowing which petticoats to pair, how to layer them so the shape came out right, how to keep the hems even and the volume balanced. A well-dressed woman or her maid understood these things instinctively, building the foundation with the quiet expertise of long practice. So on go the petticoats, one after another, each settling over the last, softening the frame, adding their warmth and rustle and weight. Your lower half is now an architectural achievement in its own right, a carefully constructed foundation of steel and starch and layered cloth. And crowning all of this labour at long last will come the dress. But not yet. First, take a moment to appreciate that you're now carrying a small wardrobe on your hips, and the visible part of your outfit remains entirely hypothetical. Let us pause and take stock of what you're now carrying, because it is genuinely a lot. Between the corset, the cage or bustle, and the small mountain of petticoats, A fully dressed Victorian woman could be hauling somewhere in the region of 15 pounds of clothing, and in winter, with heavier fabrics, considerably more. That is roughly the weight of a large house cat strapped permanently to your lower half, except the cat is made of steel and starch and cannot be persuaded to get off. Every step, every stair, every attempt to simply cross a room becomes a small feat of endurance. To really feel this, imagine going about your ordinary day with a substantial weight distributed around your waist and hips, dragging at you with every movement, not carried in your arms where you might set it down, but attached, worn, inescapable from the moment you dressed to the moment you undressed at night. There was no putting it aside for a while. The weight was simply part of being clothed, and it came along everywhere you went, all day, every day. The corset itself, with its bones of whalebone or steel, had real heft. The cage crinoline, though lighter than the petticoats it replaced, was still a framework of metal hoops. The bustle added its own structure, and the layered petticoats and the yards of skirt fabric piled weight upon weight, all of it hanging from a waist already compressed by lacing. The distribution mattered too. So much of the load sat low and wide, pulling at your hips and lower back, requiring constant small adjustments of balance and posture just to move naturally. Now factor in the world these women had to move through. Houses of the period were tall and vertical, with staircases everywhere, and servants and mistresses alike spent their days climbing them. Every trip upstairs meant hauling that full weight of clothing up flight after flight. Every stoop, every reach, every step out into a muddy street, every climb into a carriage was performed while wearing the equivalent of a permanent, awkwardly balanced load. It was physical labour simply to exist while dressed. Winter made it heavier still. Cold weather called for thicker fabrics, heavier wools, more layers for warmth, and so the seasonal wardrobe grew denser and more substantial, precisely when the weather made everything harder anyway. A woman might add weight for warmth and then trudge out into cold, wet streets that soaked her hems and added the sodden weight of water to the already considerable burden of cloth. The modern comparison is almost uncomfortable. Think about how we complain when a winter coat feels too heavy, or when a loaded backpack drags at our shoulders for an afternoon. Now imagine that as your baseline, your ordinary, unremarkable state, worn without complaint because there was simply no alternative, and because every other woman around you was carrying exactly the same. The weight was normalized into invisibility. Nobody remarked on it, because it was universal. And this is perhaps the quietly staggering part. The women of this era carried all of this while doing everything else a life required, running households, raising children, labouring, socialising, travelling, all of it conducted from within pounds of structured clothing. Their strength and endurance were real, even if entirely uncelebrated, because the sheer physicality of being properly dressed was a daily, grinding demand that never let up. So take stock, standing there in your foundation garments, and feel the weight already gathering at your waist and hips before the dress has even gone on. This is what fashion cost, measured in pounds carried up every staircase for a lifetime. It is a heaviness that never quite lifted, a constant companion, and a testament to just how much these women quietly hauled through their days without ever being asked whether it was worth it. Now, at long last, we reach the dress itself, and the top half is called the bodice. It is fitted, and I mean seriously fitted, tailored snugly over the corset so that not a single wrinkle dares to appear. It fastens up the front or the back with a long unbroken column of tiny buttons or hooks, each one placed with the apparent goal of testing the patience of whoever is doing them up. Once you're buttoned into the bodice, you're committed. There is no quick unzip, no loosening after a big lunch. You're in it, upright and firmly encased, until someone helps you out of it hours later. The bodice was the crowning structural piece of the visible outfit, the part that shaped and covered the upper body, and it was tailored with real precision. Fitted directly over the corset, it followed the smooth-shaped line the corset had created, hugging the torso closely so that the fashionable silhouette read cleanly from every angle. A well-made bodice showed no gaping, no bunching, no stray wrinkle. It sat as though moulded onto the wearer, which, given the foundation beneath it, was very nearly the case. Achieving that fit meant fastenings, and lots of them. Rows of small buttons or hooks and eyes ran the length of the closure, whether up the front or frequently up the back, and each one had to be done individually. There was no single quick mechanism, no zip to yank, just a long, patient sequence of tiny fastenings worked one after another. A back fastening bodice, of course, brought us right back to the eternal Victorian truth. You could not do it yourself, and a helper had to stand behind you, working her way methodically up your spine. The number of these fastenings could be genuinely daunting. A close-fitted bodice might have a dozen or 2 dozen buttons or hooks marching up its closure, each small and fiddly, each requiring a moment of careful attention. Doing them up was slow. Undoing them was slow. The whole process demanded time and patience from both the wearer and whoever was assisting, and there was simply no way to rush it without risking a missed fastening and a spoiled line. Once you were in, you were truly in. This is the part that catches the modern mind off guard. There was no discreet loosening after a large meal, no shrugging half out of it for a moment of relief, no quick escape. The bodice held you upright and firmly encased, working in concert with the corset beneath to keep your posture rigid and your form fashionably smooth. You committed to it in the morning and remained committed until someone helped you undo every last fastening at night. The sensation was one of being neatly, thoroughly contained. The bodice added its own layer of structure atop the corset, and together they produced that composed, upright bearing so characteristic of the era. You did not slump in a fitted bodice. You did not sprawl. You sat and stood and moved with the careful poise the garment demanded, because it gave you no other option. The comparison to modern clothing is stark. We're accustomed to garments that stretch, that slip on and off in seconds, that forgive a big lunch or a long day. The bodice forgave nothing. It was tailored to a fixed shape and fastened to hold it, a garment built for appearance and endurance rather than ease. Getting into it was a project, and staying in it was a discipline. So the bodice goes on, and the helper begins the slow climb of buttons or hooks, and piece by tiny piece you're sealed into the upper half of your outfit. When the last fastening's done, you're firmly encased, upright, and committed for the duration. The dress has finally, visibly begun, and there is no getting out of it now until the whole day is done. With the bodice on, it is time for the skirt, and this is where the fabric budget really goes to die. A single fashionable Victorian skirt could swallow yards upon yards of material, gathered, pleated, and draped over all that scaffolding beneath. It is heavy, it is long, and it has strong opinions about staircases, muddy streets, and open fireplaces. You learn to gather it in one hand to move, to sweep it aside to sit, and to keep it a respectful distance from candles, because a trailing hem near an open flame was not a fashion risk. It was a very real household hazard. The amount of fabric involved was genuinely enormous. To drape gracefully over a wide crinoline, or to cascade dramatically from a bustle, a skirt needed material and plenty of it, gathered and pleated at the waist to create fullness and arranged to fall in the fashionable line of the moment. Yards and yards went into a single skirt, which is a large part of why clothing was so costly and why fabric was treated as the precious resource it was. Every fashionable silhouette was, in part, a display of how much material a household could afford to hang on one woman. That fabric brought weight, and by now weight is an old friend of ours. Layered over the frame and petticoats, the skirt added substantially to the load already gathered at your waist, and it did so with a long hem that swept the ground. Movement had to be managed. You learned to gather a handful of skirt and lift it slightly to walk, to sweep it aside as you lowered yourself to sit, to be forever aware of where all that trailing material was in relation to the world around you, and the world around you was frequently hostile to a long hem. The streets of a Victorian town were, to put it gently, filthy, a churned mixture of mud and horse traffic and every kind of grime, and a trailing skirt dragged straight through all of it. A hem could be soaked and soiled within a few steps of leaving the house, which is precisely why more practical skirts for walking out were often made a touch shorter to clear the muck. Indoors was cleaner but no less full of obstacles, with staircases to negotiate and furniture to navigate around all that fabric. The most serious hazard, though, was fire, and this is no exaggeration for comedic effect. Homes of the period were lit and heated by open flames, candles, oil lamps and coal fires in open grates, and a long full skirt of a light fabric brushing too near an open flame could catch alight with terrible speed. It was a genuine and recognised danger of the age, a grim risk that came bundled with all that beautiful trailing material. Keeping your hem well clear of the fire was not fussiness, it was self-preservation. So a woman developed an entire physical vocabulary for living with a skirt, the graceful gather of fabric in one hand, the practiced sweep to clear a chair, the automatic awareness of flame and mud and stare. These movements became second nature, learned so early and practiced so constantly that they looked effortless, when in truth they were the constant low-level management of a large, heavy, hazard-prone garment. The modern comparison can only really reach for the longest, fullest formal gowns, the kind worn once for a special occasion and treated with careful attention throughout the evening. Now make that everyday wear, worn to walk ordinary streets and climb ordinary stairs and sit by ordinary firesides, and you have the Victorian skirt. It was beautiful, it was expensive, and it demanded constant vigilance. So the skirt settles over the frame, yards of it cascading into the fashionable shape, and you take up that familiar handful of fabric, ready to move through a world full of mud and flame and staircases that were never designed with your hem in mind. The dress is complete, and it has, as promised, a great many strong opinions. By now you may have noticed a recurring theme, and it is this: almost nothing you are wearing can be fastened by the person actually wearing it. The corset laces up the back, the bodice buttons up the spine, the skirt hooks at a waist you can no longer comfortably reach or even see. Victorian women's clothing was quite simply not designed for independence. It assumed at every stage that a second pair of hands would always be there, which is a lovely thought until it is a cold morning, the maid is late, and you're standing in your chemise wondering how on earth you're supposed to even begin. Step back and look at the whole assembly, and the pattern is undeniable. Time and again, the critical fastenings sit exactly where the wearer's own hands cannot reach them. Up the back, along the spine, at a cinched waist rendered unbendable by the corset. It is as though the entire wardrobe was engineered on the unspoken assumption that a woman would never, under any circumstances, be alone when she needed to dress. And for the classes who wore the most elaborate versions, that assumption largely held true. This was not accidental, and it was not merely inconvenient. It was quietly revealing. Clothing that requires help to put on is clothing that announces you have help. The very impracticality of a back-fastening bodice was, in its way, a statement of status. A woman who could not dress herself was a woman who didn't need to, who had a maid or a household to assemble her each morning. The dependence was built into the design, and the dependence was part of the point. For the woman with servants, this created that strange helplessness we touched on earlier, the grand lady rendered unable to clothe her own body. Her mornings ran on the schedule of her maid's availability. Her ability to change outfits through the day, and there were several changes, depended entirely on having someone present to do her up and undo her again. Independence, so admired in the abstract, dissolved the moment she stood in her underthings and reached for a fastening she could not touch. For the woman without servants, the same clothing created a daily social necessity. She could not simply dress alone in dignified privacy. She needed someone, and so sisters laced sisters, mothers buttoned daughters, friends and neighbours helped each other before church and before outings. Getting dressed became a shared communal act. By sheer mechanical requirement, a small daily cooperation forced into being by the placement of a few dozen buttons. Picture the failure state because it was real. A cold morning, the fire not yet lit, the maid delayed, or ill, or simply late, and a woman standing there in her chemise, fully aware that the corset laces up the back, the bodice buttons up the spine, and the skirt hooks somewhere behind her out of reach. She is, in that moment, genuinely stuck, unable to progress past her underclothes without another person. All the finery in the wardrobe means nothing without a helping hand to fasten it. The modern comparison throws it into sharp relief. We prize clothing precisely for its independence. Garments we can throw on and take off entirely alone, zips we can reach, elastic that forgives, whole outfits assembled in seconds without a soul to assist. The idea that dressing might require another person strikes us as almost unimaginable. And yet for the Victorian woman it was simply the shape of every single morning. So notice the theme, standing there fully dressed at last. Nearly every step of this long process depended on hands other than your own. The clothing was beautiful, and it was elaborate, and it was, by design, impossible to manage alone. You were built each morning by someone else, fastening by fastening, and you would be taken apart the same way at night. Independence was never part of the pattern. Company, it turned out, was stitched right in. Here is a clever little trick the Victorians used to survive their own laundry problem: detachable collars and cuffs. Since washing an entire dress was an ordeal bordering on warfare, the parts most likely to get grubby, the collar at your neck and the cuffs at your wrists were made to button on and off separately. That way you could swap in a fresh, crisp white collar each day and give the impression of being immaculately clean, while the dress underneath quietly went weeks between washes. It is the 19th century equivalent of freshening up a shirt and calling it laundry. Honestly, respect. The logic was impeccable once you understand the underlying constraint. A full dress was, as we have established, nearly impossible to launder without damaging it, so the outer garments simply were not washed often. But the human body does not stop being a human body, and the places where a garment sat directly against sweat and skin, the neck and the wrists got dirty fastest. The solution was elegant. Make those particular parts removable, so the bits that soiled could be washed frequently while the rest of the garment was spared the ordeal entirely. So collars and cuffs were made as separate pieces, buttoned or fastened onto the dress each day. Typically white, typically crisp, they framed the face and hands, exactly the areas most on display in conversation and most noticed by others. A fresh white collar at the throat read instantly as cleanliness and care, projecting an image of immaculate neatness regardless of the state of the fabric hidden beneath. And that was the quiet genius of it. The dress could go weeks without a proper wash, but nobody would know because the visible, close-inspected parts, the collar and cuffs, were changed and laundered often. The impression was one of spotless freshness. The reality was a garment that had not seen a washtub in some time. The detachable pieces did the heavy lifting of appearing clean, letting the rest of the outfit off the hook. These small pieces were cheap and easy to launder compared to a whole gown, plain scraps of white fabric that could be boiled and scrubbed and starched without the delicate anxieties that surrounded a full dress. A woman might own many collars and cuffs, cycling through them so that a fresh set was always ready, keeping up the appearance of daily cleanliness with minimal fuss and minimal risk to her expensive clothing. There is something deeply relatable in the whole arrangement, a bit of everyday human cleverness that transcends the century. We have all at some point refreshed the visible part of an outfit while quietly ignoring the state of the rest, sprayed something with a bit of freshener, worn the shirt one more time because it still looked fine from the front, focused our efforts on the parts people actually see. The Victorians simply formalised this instinct into a garment design and wore it with a straight face. The comparison to modern life practically makes itself. We freshen the collar, we deal with a visible stain, we present the clean front while the back of the closet holds garments that have not been washed in an embarrassingly long time. The detachable collar is the honest ancestor of every small cleanliness illusion we still perform. It solved a genuine problem with genuine ingenuity, and it did so without the slightest embarrassment. So on goes a fresh, crisp collar and a clean pair of cuffs, framing your face and wrists in the appearance of perfect tidiness, while the dress beneath keeps its own counsel about when it was last washed. You look immaculate, you look freshly turned out, and the great secret of Victorian cleanliness, that it was often more illusion than fact, is buttoned neatly into place at your throat. Respect, as I said. Genuine respect. You're nearly assembled, but a respectable lady does not step out with bare hands, so on go the gloves. For a proper Victorian woman, showing your naked hands in public carried roughly the same energy as showing up in your nightgown. Short gloves for day, long gloves for evening, kid leather so snug you practically had to be poured into them, sometimes with the help of powder or a special little tool to ease each finger in. And you would own many pairs, because a lady's gloves had to be spotless, which meant a single smudge could retire a glove faster than you could say afternoon tea. The rule was firm and the social meaning clear. Out in public, in company, at any occasion that mattered, a lady's hands were gloved. Bare hands in the wrong setting registered as a lapse of propriety, a small nakedness, a failure to be properly turned out. It seems a curious fixation to modern eyes, but within the elaborate etiquette of the era, gloves were simply part of being dressed, as expected as shoes and as unremarkable in their necessity. There were rules within the rules, of course, because this was an era that adored rules. Shorter gloves suited daytime, while longer gloves reaching well up the arm belonged to evening and formal occasions, pairing with the barer necklines that came out after dark. The material mattered too. Fine kid leather was prized, soft and supple and fitted close to the hand. Getting into a snug pair of kid gloves was its own small ritual, sometimes requiring a dusting of powder inside, or a special little tool to coax each finger smoothly into place. That tight fit was part of the appeal and part of the difficulty. A well-fitted glove hugged the hand closely, smooth and unwrinkled, which looked elegant but meant that pulling them on was a careful, deliberate business rather than a quick shove of the hand. You ease them on finger by finger, working the leather into place, and once on they fit like a second skin, which is exactly what fashion wanted. The real tyranny, though, was cleanliness. A lady's gloves were expected to be spotless, and light kid leather is not a forgiving material. A single smudge, a mark, a stain from something touched or brushed against could render a pair unfit to be seen. This meant that gloves were used up at a startling rate, retired the moment they showed wear, and replaced constantly. A woman who moved in society needed a genuine stockpile of them, many pairs kept ready so that a fresh, immaculate set was always at hand. The expense and effort of maintaining all these spotless gloves was considerable, another quiet drain on the household and another daily demand on a lady's attention. It was not enough to own gloves. You had to own enough of them, in good condition, in the right lengths and colours for every occasion, and you had to keep them pristine, because a soiled glove undid the whole effect of careful dressing. The comparison to modern life is a little wistful, because we have almost entirely lost this. We wear gloves against the cold and little else, and the idea that bare hands might be improper, that a smudge on a glove could be a small social crisis, feels impossibly remote. And yet we do keep our own versions of the spotless accessory, the item that must be kept immaculate to project the right impression, the small expensive things we replace the moment they show wear. So on go the gloves, eased finger by finger onto your hands, spotless and fitted and correct, the final touch that turns bare skin into proper public presentation. Your hands, so useful all morning for gripping bedposts and doing up buttons, are now sheathed and immaculate and ready to be seen. And somewhere in your wardrobe waits a whole drawer of spare pairs, because the odds of getting through the day without a single smudge are frankly not in your favour. Now for your feet, and brace yourself, because Victorian footwear did not believe in convenience either. Fashionable boots often fastened with a long row of small buttons up the side, sometimes a dozen or more per boot, each far too fiddly for human fingers. So you needed a special implement called a button hook, a little metal tool used to catch each button and drag it through its loop one at a time over and over. Doing up a single pair of boots was a small meditative ordeal, and doing it while already laced into a corset that refused to let you fold forward was an act of quiet heroism. The fashionable boot of the era rose above the ankle and fastened snugly up the side, and it did so with buttons, a great many of them, set close together in a long row. Each button had a matching loop, and each had to be fastened individually, so that closing up a boot meant working your way methodically from bottom to top, button after button after button. Multiply that by the number of buttons per boot and again by 2 boots, and you have a genuinely lengthy task simply to shoe yourself. The buttons were small and the loops were tight, deliberately so because a snug fastening gave the trim, fitted look that fashion wanted around the ankle. But small tight buttons are the enemy of human fingertips, awkward to grip and fiddly to force through their loops. This is where the button hook came in, a slender metal tool with a hook at the end made expressly for the purpose. You slipped the hook through the loop, caught the button, and drew it back through, one at a time, over and over up the row. There was a rhythm to it, a slow, patient repetition. Hook and catch and pull, hook and catch and pull, working steadily up the boot. It was almost meditative in its way, a quiet mechanical ritual performed at the start of every day. But it was also unavoidably time-consuming, another chunk of the morning devoted to a task that a modern person accomplishes with a zip or a slip of the foot in seconds. And then there was the corset, waiting to make everything worse. By the time you came to your boots, you were very likely already laced in, which meant folding forward at the waist to reach your own feet ranged from difficult to flatly impossible. So doing up your own boots became an exercise in awkward contortion, or, more sensibly, a job handed off to the maid who was already assembling you. Either way, the simple act of fastening your footwear collided directly with the immobility the corset imposed, turning a fiddly task into a genuinely tricky one. Picture the full scenario. You're laced firmly into your corset, unable to bend at the middle, and you must somehow fasten a dozen or more tiny buttons up the side of each boot using a little metal hook, working blind and at an angle your rigid torso will not permit. It is no wonder the button hook was a treasured household object. No wonder a lady's maid handled such tasks, and no wonder getting fully dressed ate so relentlessly into the morning. The comparison to modern footwear is almost comically lopsided. We step into shoes, we tug a zip, we fasten a single strap, or nothing at all. The notion of spending several minutes per foot with a specialised tool, unable even to bend down to do it, belongs to another world entirely. And yet, this was the daily reality. Footwear that demanded patience, technique, and frequently a second person. So, out comes the button hook, and the slow patient work begins, catching and drawing each small button through its loop, up one boot and then the other, until your feet are at last snugly and correctly shod. It is fiddly, it is time-consuming, and performed from within an unbending corset. It is a small, quiet feat. Your feet are ready. Only your hair and your hat remain, and those, believe it or not, may be the most demanding of all. Your body may be dressed, but your day is far from over, because now we turn to the hair, and Victorian hair was a serious commitment. Fashion demanded long hair, worn up and elaborately arranged, which meant brushing, twisting, pinning, and sometimes padding it out with extra pieces or with your own saved combings hoarded in a little dish for exactly this purpose. It could take a very long time, held together by a truly optimistic number of hairpins, and it was expected to stay flawless all day. Loose flowing hair was for children, for the bedroom, and for scandal in roughly that order. Long hair was simply the expectation for a grown woman, and it was rarely if ever cut. But long hair worn loose was not respectable for public life. The fashionable and proper style was to wear it up, gathered and arranged into whatever elaborate configuration the era favoured, close to the head and secured against the day. Achieving this daily was a real undertaking, a lengthy morning ritual that came right at the end of an already exhausting dressing process. The steps were many. First, the long hair had to be thoroughly brushed out, then divided, twisted, coiled and pinned into shape, built up into the arrangement of the moment. This took time and skill, whether performed by the woman herself or, for those who could afford it, by the same lady's maid who had already laced and buttoned her into her clothes. A truly fashionable style might be intricate, requiring patience and a practised hand to get right. Then there was the matter of volume, because fashionable styles often called for more hair than a person naturally had arranged in the right places. The solution was to pad the style out, sometimes with extra hairpieces and sometimes, remarkably, with a woman's own saved hair. Combings collected from the daily brushing were not thrown away. They were saved, tucked into a small dish or receptacle kept for the purpose, and later used to bulk out the hairstyle. It was a thrifty, practical habit that sounds strange to modern ears, but made perfect sense in an age that wasted nothing and demanded volume. Holding the whole creation together took pins, and a great many of them. A single elaborate style might rely on a startling number of hairpins to stay in place, each one working to secure a coil or anchor a twist, the entire structure held aloft by sheer accumulated pinning. And once built, it was expected to endure. The style had to survive the full day, remaining neat and flawless through every activity, which meant it had to be constructed to last from the very start. The social meaning of hair was as rigid as everything else. Long, loose flowing hair was not a public look. It belonged to childhood, to the privacy of the bedroom, and to moments of impropriety. For a grown woman to appear in company with her hair down was, depending on the setting, either childish or genuinely scandalous. Putting the hair up was in a sense part of putting on the public self, a daily transformation from private to presentable. The comparison to modern routines is telling. Many of us give our hair a quick brush and consider the matter closed. The idea of spending a substantial stretch of every single morning constructing an elaborate pinned, padded architecture atop the head, and doing so as an absolute daily necessity rather than a special occasion effort, is foreign to most modern lives. It was, for the Victorian woman, simply another expected labour. So the hair is brushed, twisted, coiled, padded and pinned into its careful arrangement. Another long stretch of the morning surrendered to the demands of proper appearance. It is elaborate, it is time-consuming, and it is held together by an act of faith and a fortune in hairpins. Your body is dressed and now your head is finished too. Nearly there. All that remains is to crown the whole creation with a hat and to anchor it with pins sharp enough to give a stranger pause. With your hair finally wrangled into submission, it is time to crown the whole creation with a bonnet or hat, because a lady did not go outdoors bareheaded any more than she went out barefoot. And these hats were not gently placed, they were anchored. Enormous decorated confections were pinned directly to that carefully built hairstyle, using hat pins that could be 6 or 7 inches of sharp steel. They kept your hat from sailing off in the wind, yes, but they also turned every fashionable woman into someone you did not particularly want to stand too close to on a crowded street corner. Going outdoors bareheaded was simply not done by a respectable woman. The head covering, whether a modest bonnet or a grand decorated hat, was as essential to proper dress as gloves or boots, a non-negotiable part of being correctly turned out for the world beyond the front door. This style of the covering shifted over the decades, from the close bonnets of the earlier era to the increasingly large and elaborate hats of later years, but the underlying rule held firm throughout. A lady covered her head to go out. Those later hats could be genuinely enormous, wide-brimmed and piled high with decoration, trimmed with ribbons, feathers, flowers, and all manner of ornament. They were confections in the truest sense, elaborate creations meant to crown the outfit and catch the eye. And being large and top-heavy, they presented an obvious problem. How do you keep such a thing anchored to your head, especially out in the open air where a gust of wind could send it sailing? The answer was the hat pin, and here is where things turned faintly alarming. A hat pin was a long, sharp steel pin, and to secure a large hat firmly to that elaborately built hairstyle, it needed real length, sometimes reaching 6 or 7 inches. The pin was driven through the hat and the hair to hold the whole assembly steady, and a big hat might need more than one. They worked beautifully for their purpose, keeping even a substantial hat locked in place against wind and movement. But a great many women walking around with several inches of exposed sharp steel projecting from their headwear created an obvious hazard, and this was recognised at the time. In crowded places, on busy streets, in packed public transport, those long hat-pin points posed a genuine risk to anyone standing too near. It became enough of a concern that the sharp ends of hat pins were the subject of real public worry, a small but pointed danger woven into the fashionable crowd. So the fashionable woman, fully assembled at last, was crowned with a large decorated hat anchored by lengths of sharp steel, elegant from a distance and mildly perilous up close. The image is a fitting one to end the dressing on. Beauty and hazard pinned together, ornamentation secured by something you would not want jabbed into your shoulder on a crowded corner. The hat completed the outfit and, incidentally, gave everyone nearby a reason to keep a respectful distance. The comparison to modern life is almost entirely lost, because we rarely wear hats at all now, let alone hats requiring several inches of steel to stay put. The whole apparatus of the anchored hat and the dangerous pin belongs firmly to a vanished world of elaborate headwear and rigid rules about covering the head. We simply do not live with these particular small perils anymore. So the bonnet or hat is settled onto the finished hairstyle and driven firmly into place with its long sharp pins, and the great morning labour is, at very long last, complete. You are chemised, drawed, stockinged, laced, covered, caged or bustled, petticoated, buttoned into your bodice, draped in your skirt, gloved, booted, coiffed, and now crowned and anchored. You're fully, correctly, exhaustingly dressed. It took hours. And you are, at minimum, dressed for only the next little while, because the day, as we will see, has many more costume changes in store. Let us gently address the elephant in the very tightly laced room. What was all of this actually doing to your body? The honest answer is more complicated than the horror stories suggest. Extreme tight lacing could restrict your breathing, leave you short of breath, and make bending, deep breathing, or a hearty laugh a genuine challenge, which is part of why fainting was such a fashionable hazard and why every drawing room seemed to have a couch conveniently nearby. Historians now push back on the goriest claims about crushed organs, but there is no doubt that a lifetime spent laced in came with real, everyday physical costs. Start with the breathing, because that was the most immediate and universal effect. A firmly laced corset compressed the lower torso and restricted how far the ribs and abdomen could expand, which meant shallower breaths and less room for a deep lungful of air. For everyday moderate lacing, this was a manageable nuisance. For tighter lacing, it could leave a woman genuinely short of breath, particularly during exertion. Climbing stairs, hurrying, or any real physical effort became noticeably harder when your capacity to draw a full breath was constrained by the garment around your middle. This connects directly to the era's reputation for fainting. The image of the Victorian lady swooning onto a conveniently placed couch is a cultural cliché, and while the reasons for fainting were surely varied, restricted breathing from a tightly laced corset was plausibly among them. When you cannot take a deep breath, when you are warm and standing and laced firm, a wave of light-headedness is not hard to imagine. The famous fainting couch, that low seat seemingly designed for exactly such moments, speaks to a culture that expected these episodes and made provision for them. Bending and movement were affected too. The rigid structure of the corset simply did not permit the torso to fold or twist freely, which is why so much of this dressing process had to be sequenced around the loss of flexibility. A hearty laugh, a deep breath, a stoop to pick something up, all were constrained by the garment. The body was held in a fixed, upright posture, elegant to look at and genuinely limiting to live in. Now here is where honesty demands we pump the brakes hard, just as we did with the wasp waist. The most lurid claims about corsetry, the crushed and displaced organs, the ribs supposedly removed to achieve a smaller waist, the tales of grievous internal damage as routine, are largely exaggerations and myths. Modern historians have looked hard at these stories and pushed back firmly on the goriest versions. The reality was more moderate, and the everyday corset worn by everyday women was a supportive garment rather than an instrument of grievous harm. But moderation is not the same as harmlessness, and it would be wrong to swing so far toward reassurance that we pretend there were no costs at all. A lifetime spent laced in day after day from a young age did shape the body and did impose real physical limitations. The restricted breathing was real, the constrained movement was real, and for those who genuinely practiced extreme tight lacing, the discomforts were greater still. The truth sits in the sensible middle. Neither the cartoon of routine mutilation, nor a picture of perfect comfort. The modern parallel returns once more, because every age asks the body to conform to a shape it does not naturally hold, and every age pays some cost for it. The corset was the era's demand, worn universally, accepted as normal, and carried with a costs that range from the mildly limiting to the genuinely difficult. So as you stand there laced and upright, breathing a little shallowly, understand that this was the everyday physical reality beneath the elegance, more complicated than the horror stories, but far from nothing. Here is the part that truly breaks the modern brain. Getting dressed once was not the end of it. A fashionable Victorian woman was expected to change her clothing several times over the course of a single day, each activity demanding its own correct costume. A morning dress for at home, a different dress for walking out, another for receiving visitors in the afternoon, and something grander again for dinner. Every change meant repeating great chunks of the ordeal you have just endured. So no, you were not dressed for the day. You were dressed for the next couple of hours, at best. Let the horror of that sink in properly. Everything you have just been walked through, the layering, the lacing, the buttoning, the pinning, the whole exhausting hours-long assembly, was not a once-daily event. It was a recurring one. The fashionable woman did not simply get dressed in the morning and go about her day. She dressed and redressed repeatedly, swapping her entire outfit to suit whatever the next portion of the day required. The rules governing these changes were detailed and taken seriously. Each activity, each setting, each time of day had its appropriate costume, and appearing in the wrong dress for the occasion was a genuine social lapse. There was a dress for the private morning hours spent at home, a different one for venturing out of doors, another for the ritual of receiving or paying afternoon visits, and something finer still for dinner and the evening. To move through the day correctly was to move through a sequence of costumes, each shed and replaced as the hours turned. The practical burden of this is almost dizzying to contemplate. Every change was not a simple swap of a top. It meant unfastening and refastening great portions of the whole elaborate assembly, and for the layers that needed help it meant summoning the maid again. The morning's labour was not a one-time cost paid at dawn. It was a repeated tax levied several times over as the day progressed. A woman might be laced, buttoned, and pinned into fresh configurations 3 or 4 times before she finally undressed for bed. This is also why the lady's maid was so indispensable and so perpetually busy. Her job did not end when her mistress was dressed the first time. It recurred with each costume change. Her hands required again and again to fasten what the wearer could not reach herself. The whole rhythm of a fashionable woman's day was structured around these transitions, around having the right dress ready and the right help available at each turn. And it speaks to what all this dressing was really about, which was display and propriety far more than practicality. A wardrobe that demanded several complete changes a day was a wardrobe that announced leisure, status, and the resources to support such a life. The woman who changed for morning, for walking, for visiting, and for dinner was performing her position with every outfit, demonstrating that she had the clothes, the help, and the time to do things properly. The modern comparison strains to keep up. Most of us dress once and wear that outfit clear through the day, perhaps changing into something comfortable in the evening if we're feeling fancy. The idea of a full wardrobe rotation as a daily obligation, of repeating an hours-long dressing process multiple times before nightfall, belongs to a vanished world of leisure, ritual, and rigid social scripting. We simply do not live at that pace of costume. So brace yourself, because the morning ordeal was only the first of several. You're dressed now, correctly and completely, for the private hours of the morning. But the afternoon will demand a different you, and the evening a grander one still. The dressing never really finished. It merely paused between changes. Welcome to a day measured not in hours but in outfits. Say you wish to leave the house, perhaps for a stroll or a bit of shopping. You cannot simply go. You must first put on your walking dress. This was a more practical costume, made of hardier fabric, with a hem ideally short enough to clear the truly appalling state of the streets, which were a rich stew of mud, horse traffic, and things best left undescribed. Add a jacket or mantle, gloves, a sturdy pair of boots, a hat pinned firmly down, and possibly a parasol, and you are finally correctly armoured for the deeply ordinary act of walking down the road. The walking dress was, by the standards of this wardrobe, the sensible one. Where the morning dress was for private indoor hours and the evening dress was for shimmer and display, the walking costume was built for the practical business of being out in the world, and so it was made of sturdier, more hard-wearing fabric that could stand up to weather and movement. It was still elaborate, still layered, still corseted underneath, but it was the version of fashion that acknowledged you might actually need to do something. The hem was the key concession to reality. A trailing floor-length skirt dragged straight through the filth of the streets. So a walking dress ideally had a hem raised just enough to clear the ground, sparing it the worst of the muck. And the muck was considerable. The streets of a Victorian town were a genuinely appalling mixture of mud, horse traffic and its abundant leavings, refuse and grime. A churned mess that any long hem would soak up like a sponge. A shorter, more practical hem was simply self-defense against the state of the road. Then came the additional layers that turned an indoor outfit into outdoor armour. A jacket or a mantle went over the dress for warmth and propriety. Gloves covered the hands as always, and a sturdy pair of boots protected the feet against the ground you were about to walk through. The hat, pinned firmly down with those long hat pins, had to be secured against the open air and its winds. And a parasol might be added, shading the complexion from the sun, because a pale, untanned complexion was prized, and a lady protected hers accordingly. Assembling all of this to step outside meant that even a simple errand carried a real preparatory cost. You did not just grab a coat and go. You changed into the walking costume, added the outer layers, secured the hat, pulled on the gloves, took up the parasol, and only then were you correctly equipped to face the street. The ordinary act of walking down the road required its own deliberate outfitting, its own small ritual of preparation. There is something quietly telling in how much effort it took simply to go outside. The world beyond the front door was, for a lady, a place to be entered properly dressed and properly protected, from the filth underfoot to the sun overhead, to the wind that might steal a hat. Every element of the walking costume answered some feature of the outdoor world, turning a stroll into an expedition requiring the right gear. The modern comparison is almost comically simple by contrast. We pull on shoes and a jacket and step out, the whole preparation taking moments. The notion that leaving the house required a dedicated change of dress, a specific set of protective layers, and a small arsenal of accessories feels wildly elaborate to us. And yet, for the Victorian woman it was simply what going out entailed. So into the walking dress you go. Hardy fabric and practical hem, jacket and gloves and boots and pinned hat and parasol all assembled, and at last you're correctly armoured for the deeply ordinary business of a walk. The street awaits, in all its muddy, crowded, sun-struck glory, and you are finally dressed to survive it. Home again, and it is time to change once more, this time into your afternoon or visiting dress, because the ritual of calling on friends and receiving guests had rules, and those rules had outfits. This dress was finer than your morning things, meant for sitting decorously in a parlour, balancing a teacup, and making pleasant conversation while every layer you're wearing conspires against comfort. You perch on the edge of the chair to accommodate the bustle. You keep your spine straight because the corset gives you no other option, and you smile serenely, as though you're not, in fact, quietly counting the minutes. The afternoon was the appointed time for one of the era's central social rituals, the paying and receiving of calls. Ladies visited one another, sat together in parlours, took tea and made conversation according to an intricate etiquette of who called on whom, how long one stayed, and how it was all conducted. This social ritual had its own dress code, And so back home from your walk, you changed yet again into the afternoon or visiting dress, a costume finer than your morning wear and suited to the genteel business of company. This dress was made to be seen at close quarters in a comfortable indoor setting, and so it was more refined than the practical walking costume, more decorative than the private morning dress. It was the outfit in which you would sit and be looked at, in which you would represent yourself to visiting friends and acquaintances, and so it carried a certain quiet elegance appropriate to the parlour and the tea table. The activity it was built for was essentially sitting still and talking, which sounds restful until you remember everything you were wearing beneath it. Perching in a parlour while corseted, bustled and layered was its own small endurance test. You sat on the very front edge of your chair because the bustle occupied the space behind you, keeping you from settling back. You held your spine straight because the corset permitted nothing else. And you did all this while balancing a teacup, managing your skirts, and keeping up the flow of pleasant conversation etiquette demanded. So the serene composure of a lady at afternoon tea, so elegant and effortless in appearance, concealed a genuine physical discipline underneath. Every gracious posture was shaped by the garments enforcing it. The upright bearing was the corset, the forward perch was the bustle, the measured movements were the constraints of layered fabric. What looked like natural refinement was in large part the visible result of being firmly encased and carefully managing it all with practiced poise. There is a real comedy in the gap between the surface and the reality. On the surface, a peaceful gathering of ladies taking tea in a sunlit parlour, all grace and gentle conversation. Beneath the surface, each of them laced tight, perched uncomfortably, spine forced straight, quietly enduring the accumulated demands of her outfit while smiling as though perfectly at ease. The serenity was real as performance and effortful as experience, a small daily act of grace under pressure. The modern comparison lands with a wince of recognition. We have all sat through a social occasion in uncomfortable clothing, smiling pleasantly while quietly wishing we could loosen something or shift position, or simply go home and change. Now imagine that as the baseline for an entire ritualized afternoon, conducted in garments that dictated your very posture, with etiquette forbidding any visible sign of discomfort. The Victorian visiting hour was that experience, formalized and repeated. So into the visiting dress you go, finer than the mornings, and off to perch and paw and converse with serene composure, while your corset holds your spine and your bustle keeps you on the edge of your seat. You will look perfectly at ease, you will be perfectly uncomfortable, and you will smile through every minute of it, because that too was simply part of being properly dressed. As evening falls, the rules perform a sudden and dramatic about-face. All day you've been buttoned to the chin, covered from wrist to neck, and now, for dinner and evening events, the fashionable dress abruptly bares your shoulders and lowers the neckline in a way that would have been unthinkable at breakfast. The fabrics turn to silk and satin, the trimmings grow richer, and the whole effect is meant to shimmer in candlelight. It is a strange logic, covered by day and daring by night, but you do not make the rules, you simply change outfits, yet again, to obey them. The reversal really was that stark. Through the whole of the day, propriety demanded coverage. Necklines rose to the throat, sleeves reached the wrist, and a respectable woman was buttoned and covered from top to bottom, her collar fresh and high, her hands gloved, scarcely an inch of skin on display. Modesty was the daytime rule, observed without exception in every morning, walking and visiting costume. And then evening arrived and turned that rule on its head. For dinner, and for the formal events of the night, fashion suddenly called for bare shoulders and a low neckline, a degree of exposure that would have been shocking, even scandalous in the daylight hours. What was improper at breakfast became not only acceptable but expected after dark. The same body that had been covered to the chin all day was now, Come evening, fashionably bared across the shoulders and décolletage, the materials shifted to match the occasion. Where daytime dresses might be of sturdier or more modest stuff, evening wear reached for silk and satin, fabrics that caught and returned the light. The trimmings grew richer and more lavish, the whole garment designed to shimmer and glow, because evening was lit by candlelight and lamplight, and the fashionable dress was made to look its most magnificent in that soft, flattering glow. Evening dress was display at its fullest, the grandest costume of the entire daily rotation. There is a genuine strangeness to the logic, and it is worth sitting with rather than simply accepting. Why should the neck and shoulders be improper by day and fashionable by night? The rules do not yield an obvious reason. They simply were the rules, an inherited etiquette of when the body might be shown and when it must be covered, tied to the time of day and the formality of the occasion. It made its own internal sense to those who lived by it, and looks delightfully arbitrary from the outside. For the woman living it, of course, the reasoning was beside the point. The rule existed, and so as evening fell, she changed once more, out of her covered afternoon dress and into the bared and shimmering evening gown, obeying the code as she obeyed all the others. It was simply another costume change, another required transformation, this one turning the day's modesty into the night's splendour. The modern comparison actually survives here better than in most of these segments, because we too dress up for the evening, reaching for finer fabrics and a bit more glamour when night and occasion call for it. The instinct to save the shimmer and the daring for evening is one we still recognise. What we have lost is the rigidity, the sense that the rules of coverage flipped so completely and so obligatorily at a fixed point in the day. So as the light fades, you change yet again, shedding the covered propriety of daytime for the bared shoulders and shimmering silk of the evening gown. It is a strange rule, this sudden nighttime daring after a day buttoned to the chin, but you do not question it. You simply dress for it. The candlelight waits, and you, transformed once more, are ready to shine in it. Not every costume was about vanity. When someone in the family died, a Victorian woman entered mourning, and mourning came with its own strict and detailed wardrobe. In the deepest days she dressed head to toe in dull black, often in a crimped fabric called crepe, avoiding anything shiny or cheerful, sometimes for a year or longer depending on who had been lost. Only gradually over many months was she permitted to ease into greys and muted purples as her grief was considered to soften. It was demanding and costly, but beneath all the rigid etiquette lay something very human, a way of wearing sorrow so the world could see it and be gentle. Mourning was a serious and highly formalised institution in Victorian life, governed by an elaborate code that dictated exactly what a grieving woman should wear and for how long. It was not left to individual feeling. There were established rules, widely understood and closely observed, that translated the private experience of loss into a public, visible costume. To be in mourning was to dress the part according to a detailed script. The deepest stage of mourning, worn immediately after a significant loss, called for full black from head to toe, and not just any black, but a specifically sombre, non-reflective sort, often achieved with a dull, crimped fabric called crepe, deliberately chosen for its lack of shine. Anything bright, glossy, cheerful or ornamental was set aside entirely. The mourning woman became a study in unrelieved darkness, her dress announcing her grief before she said a word. The duration was set by the closeness of the relationship to the person who had died. Deep mourning for a husband could stretch on for a very long time, a year or more, while lesser losses called for shorter periods, and the emergence from mourning was itself staged and gradual. A woman did not simply return to colour all at once. She passed through defined phases, easing over many months out of deepest black and into what was called half-mourning, permitted at last to wear greys and muted purples as the prescribed period of grief was considered to soften. All of this was demanding and expensive. Entering mourning meant acquiring a whole wardrobe in the correct sombre materials, an outlay that fell on the household precisely when it was already dealing with loss. The crepe and the black garments, the different pieces for the different stages, the accessories to match, all had to be obtained and worn according to the code. Grief, formalised this thoroughly, carried a real practical and financial weight alongside its emotional one. And yet, for all its rigidity, there was something genuinely humane at the heart of the custom, and it deserves to be honoured rather than mocked. The mourning dress made grief visible. It told the world, plainly and without the need for words, that this person had suffered a loss and was moving through sorrow, and a world that could see her grief could respond to it, could soften toward her, could extend the gentleness and consideration that a person in mourning needed. The costume was a signal, and the signal invited kindness. This is not a subject for the dry humour that has carried us through so much of this dressing. Loss is loss, in any century, and the elaborate rituals of Victorian mourning, however strange their particulars, grew out of the same tender human need we still feel to mark a death, to honour it, and to be treated gently while we grieve. The black dress and the crepe were the outward form of something deeply and recognisably human. So the mourning wardrobe stands apart from all the rest, not a matter of vanity or display, but of sorrow made visible. The rules were strict, the black was unrelieved, the cost was real, and beneath it all lay a genuine and gentle purpose, to let the world see a woman's grief, and to let the world be kind to her in it. Let us talk money, because all of this fabric and boning and fine trimming did not come cheap. Cloth was expensive, skilled dressmaking was expensive, and a lady of standing was expected to own a whole rotating arsenal of dresses for every hour and occasion. For wealthy families, this was merely a large bill. For everyone else, it was a constant grinding calculation of making do, remaking old gowns into new styles, turning worn fabric inside out and carefully mending anything that could possibly be mended. A woman's wardrobe could represent a genuinely staggering share of a household's spending, all of it worn quietly on her back. The fundamental fact behind all this was that fabric itself was costly. In an age before cheap mass-produced clothing filled every shop, cloth represented real value, and the yards upon yards devoured by a single fashionable skirt were a genuine expense. Add to that the boning, the trimmings, the fine materials for evening wear, and the skilled labour of a dressmaker to construct it all properly, and a single good dress became a significant purchase. Clothing was not disposable, it was an investment, and a lady of standing did not need just one dress, she needed many. As we have seen, the fashionable day demanded a rotating wardrobe, morning dress, walking dress, visiting dress, evening dress, and morning wear when the occasion arose, each in its appropriate materials and styles. To dress correctly through a full day, a full week, a full social calendar, required owning a whole arsenal of garments, and maintaining that arsenal was an ongoing and substantial cost. For the wealthy, this was simply a large line in the household accounts, absorbed as the price of moving in the right circles and appearing as one position demanded. But for the far greater number of women who were not wealthy, the cost of clothing became a constant grinding exercise in ingenuity and thrift. If you could not simply buy new dresses whenever fashion turned, you made do, and making do was a real skill in its own right. That skill took many forms. Old gowns were remade into newer styles, their fabric recut and reworked to follow the changing fashions rather than being replaced outright. Worn material was turned, quite literally reversed inside out so that the less faded surface faced the world, extending the life of a garment well past what its condition might suggest. Anything that could be mended was mended, patched and repaired and kept in service, because to discard a garment was to discard real value. This constant labour of alteration, remaking, turning and mending fell largely to women, whether the lady of a modest house doing it herself or the servants and seamstresses employed to do it for wealthier families. It was quiet, skilled, unglamorous work, the ongoing management of a wardrobe as a valuable resource to be maintained and stretched rather than casually consumed. A great deal of effort went into simply keeping a woman properly clothed. The scale of it, measured against a household's means, could be genuinely staggering. A woman's wardrobe might represent an enormous share of what a family spent, a substantial portion of its resources devoted to the clothing worn on one person's back, for the sake of appearing correctly dressed. Fashion was not a trivial expense. It was, for many households, a major and unrelenting one. The modern comparison is almost disorienting, living as we do in an age of cheap and plentiful clothing, where garments are so inexpensive that we discard them freely and rarely think to mend. The Victorian relationship to clothing, treating each garment as valuable, mending and remaking rather than replacing, devoting real money and real labour to a wardrobe, belongs to a vanished economy of cloth. What we throw away, they carefully turned inside out and wore again. Spare a thought now for what happened when any of this actually needed washing, because Victorian laundry was a brutal, all-consuming affair. There were no machines, so laundry meant hauling and heating water by hand, scrubbing, boiling, wringing, rinsing, bluing, starching, and ironing with heavy flat irons warmed on the stove, all across days of hot, back-breaking labour. This is precisely why the outer layers were so rarely washed, and why that humble chemise and those detachable collars worked so hard. Doing the wash was one of the most dreaded jobs of the household, and someone, usually a woman, was worn to the bone doing it. Understand first that there were no machines to help, none of the appliances that make modern laundry a matter of pressing a button and walking away. Every single step was done by hand, by human muscle, and the whole undertaking was so large and so laborious that it typically consumed multiple days and was dreaded accordingly. Laundry was not a chore squeezed into an afternoon. It was a major recurring ordeal that dominated the household when its time came around. The process began with water, and water was heavy and had to be hauled. Bucket after bucket was carried and then heated over a fire or stove, because so much of the work required hot water. Then came the washing itself, the scrubbing of garments by hand to work out the dirt, and the boiling of certain items to clean them thoroughly, laborious and hot and demanding of constant attention and effort. From there, the steps kept coming. Everything had to be wrung out by hand, a genuinely strenuous task that wrung the strength from the person doing it as surely as the water from the cloth. Then rinsing, then bluing, a step that used a blue tint to counteract yellowing and keep whites looking white, then starching for the items that needed crispness, the collars and cuffs and linens that were meant to hold their shape, and finally the ironing, done with heavy flat irons that had to be heated on the stove, used until they cooled, and swapped for another hot iron, over and over, pressing garment after garment. The whole affair was hot, heavy, and back-breaking from start to finish, days of labour that left whoever performed it thoroughly worn out, and someone did perform it, in every household. In poorer homes it was the woman of the house herself, adding this enormous recurring task to everything else she managed. In wealthier homes it fell to servants, or the wash was sent out to laundresses who made their hard living doing this brutal work for others. Either way, real human beings were worn to the bone by it. Now the whole logic of the layered wardrobe snaps into place. This, precisely this, is why the outer garments were so rarely washed. When laundering was this punishing, you simply did not subject a delicate, elaborate dress to it any more than absolutely necessary. Instead, you let the humble washable layers do the work, the chemise absorbing the sweat, the detachable collars and cuffs taking the visible grubbiness, all of them cheap and simple enough to endure frequent washing while the precious outer layers were spared. The entire architecture of Victorian dressing was shaped in part by the sheer horror of the wash. The modern comparison is one we should perhaps appreciate more than we do. We toss a load in a machine, press a button, and return to dry, clean clothes with almost no effort at all. The idea that laundry once meant days of hauling, heating, scrubbing, boiling, wringing, and ironing by hand, that it was among the most dreaded labours of the household, is easy to forget as we stand idly waiting for the spin cycle. Someone once did all of that by hand, and it wore them down. So spare that thought for the laundry and the labourers who did it, because the elegant layered wardrobe we have spent so long assembling rested, at its foundation, on the brutal recurring toil of wash day. The chemise worked hard so the dress would not have to face the tub, and someone, somewhere in the house, worked hardest of all. At the very end of the day, exhausted and finally allowed to stop, you get to do the entire ordeal again, backwards. Out come the hat pins and the hairpins, down comes the hair. Off comes the dress, the skirt, the bodice, the petticoats, the cage or bustle, the corset cover, and at last, with a long and grateful breath, the corset itself unlaced from behind. Peeling out of it all was a slow relief, layer by layer, until you were down to that same soft chemise you started in. Only then, unencased and lighter by many pounds, could you finally, genuinely rest. There is a satisfying symmetry to the day's end, though it is a tired sort of satisfaction. Everything that was so laboriously assembled in the morning and reassembled several times through the day's costume changes now had to be dismantled and dismantled in reverse order, layer coming off after layer until you arrived back at the beginning. The whole elaborate process ran backward as the day closed, and undressing as involved in its way as the dressing had been. It began at the top with the hat and the hair. Out came the long, sharp hat pins that had anchored your headwear, and then the hat itself was lifted away. Then the many hairpins were drawn out one by one, releasing the elaborate arrangement that had been built up that morning, letting the long hair come down at last from its careful architecture. There was a small relief in this alone, in feeling the weight of the pinned and padded style let go. Then the garments came off in their turn. The dress was unfastened and removed, the skirt and the bodice each shed in sequence. The petticoats came off one after another, and the cage or bustle was unstrapped from the waist and set aside, and with it went a great deal of the day's volume and weight. The corset cover was lifted away, and then at the heart of it all came the moment the whole day had been building toward, the corset itself unlaced from behind by the same helping hands that had laced it that morning. That unlacing was the great daily release. As the laces loosened and the corset came away, the compression of a full day eased at last, and you could take a long, deep, grateful breath, the kind the corset had not permitted since dawn. It is easy to imagine the sheer physical relief of that moment, the torso freed, the ribs unbound, the body allowed to expand and slump and simply be after so many hours held rigid and upright. Layer by layer the relief compounded, each garment removed, lifting away another portion of the day's burden, until you were down at last to that same soft, plain chemise you had started in so many hours before. The humble sponge of a garment that had absorbed the whole day's sweat was the first thing on, and nearly the last thing off, bookending the entire ordeal. Standing there in just the chemise, unencased and lighter by many pounds, you were finally free of it all, and only then could you truly rest. The whole exhausting architecture of Victorian dress existed to be worn through the waking day, and only at its close, undone in careful reverse, did it release you back into comfort. The lightness of being unlaced, unbuttoned, and unpinned at day's end must have been genuinely wonderful, a nightly return to the ease you'd surrendered at breakfast. The modern comparison, as ever, is a matter of moments. We shed our clothes in seconds and drop into bed. The notion of a lengthy nightly undressing, requiring help, running in careful reverse through layer after layer, belongs to that vanished world of elaborate dress. But the feeling at the end of it, the deep relief of finally being free of the day's clothing, is something any tired person can understand. So the layers come away, the corset unlaces, the breath deepens, and at last, in the soft chemise you began in, you are allowed to rest. And here is the final cruelty. None of this paused for the weather. In the depths of winter, all those layers were at least good for warmth. Those soggy hems and cold damp streets did their best to ruin that small mercy. But in high summer, you still wore the corset, still wore the petticoats, still wore the gloves and the buttoned boots and the long sleeves, sweltering politely through the heat, because fashion and modesty did not take a summer holiday. Whatever the season, the answer was the same: more layers, more effort, and a quiet, dignified refusal to admit you were uncomfortable at all. Winter at least offered a silver lining, and it would be unfair not to grant it. All those accumulated layers, the chemise and the petticoats and the wool and the heavy skirts, did a genuinely good job of holding in warmth against the cold. In an age of poorly heated houses and chilly, draughty rooms, being wrapped in pounds of insulating clothing was, for once, an advantage rather than merely a burden. The wardrobe that oppressed you in summer at least kept you warm in the deep of the year. But even that mercy came with its qualifications. The winter streets were cold, wet, and filthy, and a long hem trailing through slush and mud drank up moisture until it hung heavy and sodden and cold against your legs. The warmth of the layers indoors could turn to clammy discomfort outdoors, the damp working its way into the fabric, the cold streets doing their best to undo the insulation. Winter was the kinder season for the wardrobe, but only just, and only sometimes. Summer offered no such comfort, and this is where the cruelty of it sharpens. The clothing did not lighten meaningfully for the heat. You still laced into the corset, you still layered on the petticoats, you still pulled on the gloves, still buttoned up the boots, still wore the long sleeves and the covered neckline that daytime modesty demanded. The full architecture of dress remained in place through the hottest days, because fashion and propriety recognized no seasonal exception, and so you sweltered inside it, politely and completely. The result was a great deal of quiet suffering through the warm months, women fully encased in layered clothing under a summer sun, warm and constrained and dripping beneath it all, and expected to show no sign of the discomfort. There were lighter fabrics for summer, to be sure, and small concessions where they could be made, but the fundamental layered, corseted, covered structure held firm regardless of the temperature. You did not get to shed the corset because it was hot. You simply endured. And endurance, dignified and uncomplaining, was rather the whole point. The expectation was that a lady bore all of this in every season without visible complaint, maintaining her composure and her serene appearance, whether she was chilled to the bone in a wet winter street or quietly sweltering through a summer afternoon. To admit discomfort was itself a small failure of poise. The correct response to being too hot or too cold in one's clothing was to show nothing at all. The modern comparison brings the whole long journey to a close on a note of real appreciation. We dress for the weather with total freedom, shedding layers in the heat, wearing whatever is comfortable, letting the season dictate our clothing as it pleases. The idea of being locked into the same heavy, layered, constraining wardrobe, regardless of whether it was freezing or sweltering, and of enduring it all without complaint, throws into sharp relief just how much these women quietly put up with, year-round, for the sake of appearing correctly and properly dressed. So the seasons turned, and the wardrobe did not much yield to them, and the Victorian woman went on dressing, in warmth and in swelter alike, with the same layers, the same effort, and the same dignified refusal to let the discomfort show. Whatever the weather, the answer was more clothing and more composure, and through it all, in cold and in heat, she carried it, quietly and gracefully from the first cold morning to the last. So there it is, a single day, dressed and undressed, in the life of a Victorian woman. You woke in a freezing room and spent hours being built, layer by layer, into someone fit to be seen. You were laced until your ribs complained, caged in steel, buttoned into place by hands that were not your own, and crowned with a hat anchored by sharpened pins. You changed your outfit not once but again and again, sweltered through summers, shivered through soggy winters, and smiled serenely through it all as though none of it cost you a thing. And it did cost. The shortened breath, the aching weight carried up every staircase, the money that vanished into yards of cloth, the endless mending and turning and making do, the brutal toil of wash day falling on someone's tired hands. Beneath every elegant silhouette was a great deal of quiet endurance, borne without complaint day after day by women who simply got on with it. But they did get on with it. They laced each other in, buttoned each other up, saved their combings and swapped their collars and found small clevernesses inside the rigid rules. They dressed for grief and dressed for joy, and carried the whole heavy architecture of their era with a grace that still looks effortless in the photographs, even knowing now what it hid. So tonight, as you sink into your soft bed in clothes you chose freely, that you put on alone in seconds and can shed just as easily, spare a gentle thought for them, for the woman gripping the bedpost at dawn, and the one perched patiently on the edge of her chair, and the one finally gratefully unlaced at the end of a very long day. They carried so much. Rest easy now, you don't have to. Good night.